This is Duke University.
So, hey everyone, my name is George, and today I'll talk about the evolution of the electronics industry and technology and how it has all led to a point now where printed electronics can really be used to exploit the new materials that are available to us today. And I work in a lab that titles itself as the Laboratory of Electronics for Nanomaterials, and I work with about 7 other graduate students, and what we all do is we all come up with new ways to use nanomaterials in electronics, and we make and research and develop different devices using nanomaterials. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But I'd first like to point out that this presentation is more geared toward, say, an undergraduate who's interested in engineering, not so much my progress as of right now. So I'll definitely hit on things that everyone should be able to follow along to, but if I presented on the technical details of where my studies are going, I'm sure not very many people would be able to follow along. So I can barely follow along. So. Okay. So first let me outline my presentation. So the first thing I'm going to go over is my field, the field of physical electronics. And then I'll get into the electronics industry and nanomaterials and where the electronics industry is headed there. And then get into printed electronics and how that can be used to use nanomaterials. Nice presentation. Okay, so the field of physical electronics is a very broad description of the field, but the field is a very scientifically interdisciplinary. It contains elements of physics, chemistry, and material science. And these very scientific fields are used to construct and manipulate the physical hardware that we put into our electronics that we have in our pockets, our computers, whatnot. I like to think of the field as the line that connects the physical sciences like physics and chemistry to the data and computational sciences that basically enable the technology that we have in our world. And so that includes like the data communication and the advanced global positioning systems and satellites that we have. It's all enabled by the physical hardware that engineers physically build, as well as the advanced medical technology that we use today, and of course the softwares that are enabled by these very fast computers that we have nowadays. Artificial intelligence, data, or decision-making systems are all enabled by the hardware. So, okay, now getting into the electronics industry. So in order to describe the electronics industry, I'm first going to talk about what enables the electronics first, and then get into how the electronic industry has used the fundamental building blocks to basically push itself forward. So if you look at your phone in your pocket and you want to know what's in it, you take it apart, and when you're trying to find the fundamental building block of the electronic, you have to look at the processor. So a lot of people call this the brains of the computer or the phone, and I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard that before. If you look inside of it and you unpackage it and you take it apart, what you find is a silicon die, 2 centimeter by 2 centimeter silicon die. And if you look at it with your eye, you see a bunch of patterns in it. And what you're seeing is a solid state. It's basically all solid parts, and this is the computer of the phone. If you zoom in on this with an electron microscope, you'd be able to and this is magnified by about 1 million times. You'd be able to see transistors at a scale of 100 nanometers in this case. Some of the more recent phones, like the Galaxy S7, has transistors the size of 28 nanometers. So in this case, the transistors here are 100 nanometers, and to give some perspective, the size or the diameter of a human hair is 1,000 times greater than that length. So we are, as the electronics industry is consistently manufacturing devices and structures that work at this scale. And they make these so consistently that they work 99.999% of the time. So what do these look like? These are the fundamental building blocks I was talking about. And if you look at like a cross section of one of these, they look like this. And there are billions of these on today's processors. I think most latest processors have 12 or 13 billion transistors on them. So what is this fundamental building block? Well, it is a switch. And I'm sure some of you have heard of this when you hear about computers. Computers use ones and zeros to compute things. Well, it works or this is how it works when it's off. We assign a 0 to that. And basically what's happening is that electrons don't flow through the switch. It works just like the switch in your home when you turn on your light bulb. So no current is flowing when it's off, and we assign a 0 to that. And when it's on, current flows through it, and we assign a 1 to that. And then when we combine these switches into some specified orientation, we can yield a computation. And so if we can put enough of these switches onto a chip, the more computations we can do. So the more switches on a chip, the more computation we can do. So there's a lot of incentive to put more transistors on a chip. There's also a lot of incentive to shrink the size of the transistor. So if we shrink the size of the transistor, that means more of these transistors can fit in a smaller, in the same amount of space. So the electronics industry has been driven by shrinking the size of the transistor to put more transistors on a chip. And again, like I said previously, the electronics industry chips currently in the electronics industry have around 10 to 13 billion transistors on them. So a lot of you may have seen this before or heard of Moore's Law before. It's basically, it shows that the number of transistors on a chip has doubled every 18 months, ever since the advent of the integrated circuit in the 1970s. And in this era here, it's hard to see, but there's a highlighted area here. This is the heyday of Moore's Law, and it started with IBM's personal computer. It was basically a renowned calculator that could fit on your desk, but it was much greater than what we had previously. And this evolved all the way up into the point of the 1990s, where Intel was able to create a processor that finally allowed us to put like graphics on our computers, and people were able to make video games and edit music on their computers. So at that point, in the 90s, computers really became a part of like a consumer product rather than a tool only used for scientists and engineers. And then in the era of the 2000s, this was an era of mobile computing where the computers became fast enough and powerful enough to fit in our pockets. And so this is where the electronics industry has come to now, and it's pretty much where we are. The electronics are still getting faster as we move forward, but here's our current position. But a lot of people are trying to answer the question, where's this all going? So in the 1990s, a lot of people coined this era as the era of computing, where desktops and gaming, computer video games became a really big thing in electronics. And then into the 2000s, we moved to an era of communication, and everyone had routers in their home, and the internet really boomed. And then moving into the 2010s, we saw an era of mobility where we could put computers in our pockets, and they were faster than what we previously had. But a lot of people are asking, what's the next era moving into the 2020s? Well, this era is predicted to be the era of autonomy. And so what I mean by this is that all of our electronics are going to be equipped with sensors, and they're going to be autonomously speaking with whatever device they're equipped to. And wearables are going to become very popular, so your watch can talk to your refrigerator at home and make life convenient for you. And this is all going to be happening through the cloud autonomously, and they call this machine-to-machine communication. So this entire technology ecosystem is termed as the Internet of Things. And it is predicted by 2020 that the Internet of Things and the ecosystem surrounding it will become a $8.9 trillion market. So it's a pretty big part of our economy currently, and will continue to grow. But there are a lot of challenges with the physical hardware that needs to basically be engineered to keep pace with the market demand moving into the Internet of Things era. So this is again Moore's Law, but a lot of data that's not shown when we look at Moore's Law is the power output of the processors as we've been increasing the number of transistors on our chips. So basically what's happened in the mid-2000s is that we have leveled off on the power output because our processors are just getting too hot. They can't do any more computation because then temperature increases too high and the chip just doesn't work at that point. And along with that leveling off, it was the clock speed. So the clock speed is basically analogous to the speed of the processing, and that has leveled off as well. And what this has done is it's driven architecture, the number of cores on a processor to increase. So basically this means that parts of the processor turn off, while other parts of the processor turn on. And this is how we've kept pace with keeping more and more transistors on the chip, but mainly driven by architecture. So if you really think about what is Moore's law, this was the real era of Moore's law, where shrinking the size of the transistor led directly to performance improvements in computing. But in this era, this era was largely driven by architecture and almost computer scientists rather than us physical electronic engineers who have done the scaling of the transistor. So what does this mean? Moore's law is ending. I'm sorry, I forgot I had that picture. Another problem is we are reaching a physical limit in scaling at the actual size of these transistors. I said, I think the latest transistors are 28 nanometers. This is a transmission electron microscope image of the cross-section of one of these transistors, and a layer in these transistors has a thickness of 1.2 nanometers. So that's 12 angstroms, meaning that you can see the atoms here. Only a few atoms can fit in this layer. So if you think about, we're trying to scale these devices, there's nothing left to scale there. If we scale that any further, there's just no material left. So we're hitting a fundamental limit on what we can scale. And because we can't shrink it any further, we're not going to be able to follow this curve and keep putting more on the chip. And for the past 50 years, this is what has been driving the electronics industry. So a lot of people don't know where to go. And so a lot of people keep asking the question, does that mean the innovations in the electronics industry stop? All these things that we take for granted, will innovations like these cease to happen in the future? Well, to answer that question, we have to look ahead to the silicon chip industry. And so currently the silicon chip industry is a $330 billion industry, and it enables virtually every other part of modern technology. No one really knows what happens when it stops. It's a very difficult question to answer from an economic forecasting perspective. What happens when this industry stops progressing and growing? So the silicon industry is stuck, and we've been doing the same thing for 50 years, and we can't do it anymore, so no one knows really what's going to happen. And this video kind of illustrates the state at which the electronics industry is in.
Whoa, that's not good.
Oh, I don't need this. I'm already late.
Somebody will come. Anybody out there?
Do you have a phone?
No. Sorry. Somebody! Hello? There are two people stuck on an escalator and we need help. Now, would somebody please do something? I don't believe this. You gotta be kidding me.
I'm gonna cry.
Well, there's not enough left to do, is it?
Hello? Hey, don't worry about it. I'll fix it in a second.
You said he could fix it. All right. All right. That's more like it. Who says he can fix it?
Silicon industry is stuck. We've been doing the same thing for the past 50 years. So no one is, or everyone right now is afraid to take a leap to the next thing in the silicon chip, or I'm sorry, the processor era. So what we're doing at the laboratory of nanomaterials from electronics is we're looking into nanomaterials. So nanomaterials are basically just materials that have very unique electrical and mechanical properties And what makes them nanomaterials is that they are confined to 2 dimensions or 1 dimension. So their lattice sits in either a 2-dimensional plane or, in the case of the nano, atoms stretched in a 1-dimensional tube. And they have, again, very unique electrical and mechanical properties that differ from silicon, which is the industry standard currently. But if you look at, or if you ask the question, will these special nanomaterials replace silicon, we have to consider the economics of that question. And currently, the fabrication facilities that manufacture these silicon chips cost more than $10 billion. So there's vast amounts of infrastructure already invested into silicon. And it's a very mature technology. It's, again, we've had 50 years of progress in silicon chips. And we've gotten so good at making them that we can now switch one transistor from a 1 to a 0 at a cost of less than 10 to the negative $19. So not only are we really good at making them, they're really cheap to run, and we have vast amounts of infrastructure. Basically, this boils down to that, it boils down to silicon's not going to be replaced. So as a nanomaterials group, we have to ask ourselves, how do we use nanomaterials to create a technology that is viable? Because otherwise, people just say, why don't we just use silicon? It's cheap, we know how to use it. So as a nanomaterials group, we have to find a way to do something else. And so Dr. Herb Kromer from University of California, Santa Barbara, he's a Nobel Prize winning physicist and electrical engineer, has a lemma for a new technology. That is, the principal application of any sufficiently new and innovative technology always have been and always will be applications created by that technology. So what that translates to us as is we have to find what nanomaterials can do that silicon can't already do. So that means taking advantage of nanomaterials' unique properties and creating electronics that have never been seen before. So this brings me into printed electronics. So printed electronics is basically what you think of when you think of your printer. There's a little nozzle head in your printer and it sprays ink onto a paper and the ink evaporates and you get a little visible letter in the case of the printer at home. In this case, we can disperse nanomaterials into a solution and then aerosolize them and print them onto a substrate, and then they evaporate and we can make like a conductive line or a semiconducting line. What we can do is we can print these on virtually any substrate we want, and the substrate basically just means we can print it on anything, including flexible and transparent plastics, as I'm showing on the top right. Another great advantage to this kind of technique to electronics is that it is a very high throughput manufacturing process, meaning a lot can be done in a little amount of time, which is very attractive to manufacturers. So one of the most exciting applications for printed electronics is flexible and transparent displays. So currently we can screen print organic light emitting diodes. I think the Samsung Galaxy S7 has an AMOLED screen, so this is very applicable to current electronics. We can basically print an AMOLED screen display on a flexible and transparent substrate. And this, again, is very attractive to the display manufacturers like Samsung and LG because it can significantly lower the costs of their flexible and transparent displays, which they have already shown prototypes of. Currently, they're very expensive, but if they integrate a printing process into their manufacturing line, these costs will go way down and they'll be a part of the consumer, or the average consumer will be able to buy them once that happens. So in the Franklin lab, though, I'm sorry, Dr. Aaron Franklin is my advisor. I don't know if I've said that before, but it's Laboratory of Nanomaterials from Electronics. So we work on proving new concepts using printed electronics. So a colleague of mine is actually working on a fully printed biosensor for which you can print the entire device and you can basically dispense some blood on it and it can measure some sort of biomarker in the blood. And what this can do is it can be a device used for on-site diagnostics rather than having to take some blood and take it back to the lab and wait a few days. Rather, they can take this very durable and portable printed biosensor and use this for on-site diagnostics. So a project that I have been involved with is smart tire sensing and printing basically tire sensors along the walls of the inner walls of a tire to measure the tread depth of the tire. So basically what it can do is provide to you a real-time feedback of your tire tread depth as you drive, as well as the tire pressure. So this is something I did last semester. And this coming semester, I'm going to be working on a project studying the printed interface between carbon nanotubes and silver nanostructures, but that's a little involved, so I'll skip over that. But to summarize, basically what I've described is that the transistor has enabled virtually every aspect of modern technology, and it's no longer getting better. It's no longer progressing. We've hit a limit. And we have no idea what's going to happen once silicon chips stop progressing. But printed electronics offers a commercially viable means of moving past Moore's law into a new era of the Internet of Things by enabling application-based technologies. Thanks.
That was
I'm not sure what that
awesome. That was super interesting. I worry that my presentation won't be as interesting. This is my master's project, and I'm only halfway through it, basically. And most importantly, I have not yet finished collecting and analyzing my data. So sort of in the way that George did, I'm just going to kind of give you all sort of the setup and the thinking and the intuition about why I think this is an interesting set of things to talk about. So I have been studying crime policy for a long time, and I'm really interested in crime policy. And I've been pretty dissatisfied with the state of the literature for a while. And for the last couple of years, I've also been thinking about racism, structural racism, as it is baked into all of our public policy across the range of public policy. And so it seemed like a natural fit to put them together. And when I started doing some reading of literature and talking to some of my advisors, it seemed like a pretty interesting question. So especially racism in public policy more broadly. Why study it? Why care about it? Well, the obvious reason, of course, is that it's bad for people. When you have the power of the state, the power of the government systematically oppressing groups of people, that is bad and that is harmful for those people who are being oppressed. So it's worth understanding and seeing if you can come up with good solutions to handle that. But I have a different question. What if it is actually bad not just for the people who are directly oppressed when you have racism in public policy? What if it's actually bad for all of us? What if it sort of tears at the fabric of society and just generally makes the country a less good place to live? Well, it turns out, as I'll get to in a little while, there's a huge amount of theoretical crime literature that suggests that when you have a tearing of the social fabric of a place, that's when you get more crime and violence. And I think that intuitively, naturally, it makes sense that having institutional structural racism baked into your public policy would be a thing that tears at the social fabric. So again, I think these two things, racism and policy and violence, might be sort of intuitively linked. So, okay, first, a huge pet peeve of mine is how little people in this country seem to understand the state of violence, and I'm sure you all are much better read than most people, but violence over the last several decades, up, down, about the same, safer now, less safe now. I'm seeing a lot of downs. Yeah? Some not so sure? Okay. Yeah, good. That's right. Just a really crazy, historic, unprecedented decline for 25 years in violence, which is a good thing. In the lifetimes of, I think, all of us in this room, it has never been safer to live in this country. So that's cool. Even more profound when you look just at homicide. In 2014, it was literally the lowest homicide rate the country had ever seen since we started collecting homicide data. On average. Yeah. On average. Mm-hmm. So that's on average, and that's as of 2014, 2015. But there's still a lot. These are per 100,000 people, so that's still 5 homicides per 100,000 people. So that sucks. We can do better. We can understand how to. It is worth it to try to understand how to deal with violence. And then, as Tori points out, some places are much more violent than other places. And in a number of our big cities, it's literally never been safer to live in New York City. I mean, New York City is one of the safest cities anywhere, ever, in the country, which is cool. But other cities are not. And it's starting maybe to look like violence is taking up in some places. So that sort of renews the question, well, what are the actual kind of fundamental causes of violence, and what can we do about it? Okay, so that was our step back and thinking about just this kind of the state of violence in this country. How about the state of racism in public policy? So I think about this every day, and so I'm like pretty comfortable with all of the many ways, but to make sure we're on the same page, who can think of an example of racism in public policy, either historical or contemporary? Who's read Case for Reparations? Like Ta-Nehisi Coates, that's sort of like the classic. Okay, so what's an example?
You can talk about like housing, right?
Yeah, okay, so you gotta put a pin in that because that's my whole presentation. Yeah, sure, so like differential mandatory minimum sentences for crack than cocaine, and it just so happens that black people use crack and white people use cocaine, yeah.
The recent laws regarding like voter requirements, like they disproportionately affected people of color.
Yeah, a federal court judge said that North Carolina's voter suppression were almost surgically targeted toward black people. Other examples?
Tax policy?
Yeah, like how?
Different taxes for owning a home versus renting a home.
Yeah, okay, so stop. But yeah, so basically the point is this entire country, every set of public policies, every set of laws and institutions from the middle of the 17th century to yesterday have been founded on treating people of different races differentially. It's rife, it's absolutely everywhere, so that's a problem. And then I think it's been particularly profound in housing policy, and from the point of view of a white supremacist, of someone who would be interested in kind of bolstering white supremacy, it makes sense to me to focus so much of our racist policy and housing policy, because housing policy is everything. You know, it's the safety of your neighborhood, it's the beauty of your neighborhood, it's the quality of your schools, it's the amount of wealth you can build. So it makes sense to me that there's so much racism in housing policy. So here's sort of like a quick little rundown of the last like 120 years. So the Great Migration, right around the middle of the Jim Crow era, a bunch of black people were like, okay, we're gonna leave the South because it's terrible to live down here. We're gonna go to those more progressive northern liberal cities, and of course they weren't any better. So as soon as people in the big northern cities like New York and Cincinnati and Chicago and what have you started having millions of black people coming in, they're like, okay, well, we got to make sure that they don't get to live in good places. So white kind of entrepreneurs, if you will, saw a really kind of good opportunity to pretend that they were going to help black people buy homes, and they ended up lying to them and cheating them and deceiving them and giving them like usuriously high interest rates on their mortgages, and lying and stealing their homes and scamming, and also forcing them to live in like the worst neighborhoods. And so I consider this racism in public policy because this was just absolutely rife, and not only were there no regulations that would be put in place to protect would-be black homeowners, but I mean, this is the most litigious country in the world. We have regulations for absolutely everything, and we didn't care to have regulations for that. And not only that, but many times what we did, the predatory lending and the violence that came with it, were just absolutely straight up illegal, and police obviously couldn't be bothered to do anything about it. So just sort of like the sort of willful neglect of like just basic decency, I absolutely consider that racism in policy. And then especially in the first decade of the 20th century, the race violence and blockbusting were pretty absurd. You know, there was, yeah, I'll get into it. So 20 years after the Great Migration was kind of going, there was starting to be the beginning of a black middle class. The Black Wall Street down here in Durham is a good example. The black people had some wealth, and so they started buying decent homes in decent neighborhoods. But all the decent neighborhoods were almost entirely white, and white people were like, no way, that's not good. And so first they tried blockbusting, where they would just, like, they would get these sort of crazy scammer lenders and just be like, let's just like systematically either find a way to force all the black people out, or if we can't do that, just like all the white people pack up and leave. So you bust a block by just like kind of either making it only a white block or white block or black block. And then when that didn't work, just straight up violence, just like, oh, the black people are coming home, we're gonna kill them, we're gonna stone them, we're gonna throw Molotov cocktails through their windows, we're gonna tear their homes down, like literally just like violence, and that turned into some early rioting as well. And again, just that's just like straight up illegal, and police would just routinely not do anything about that. So redlining, who's familiar with redlining? Okay, cool. So this is the most explicitly racist of my list, and one of the rare times in the 20th century that the federal government was just explicitly racist. So around I think a little bit before World War II, but especially after World War II, the federal government got into the business of backing home mortgages. So, because they wanted to build a home-owning middle class. And so they explicitly sent the federal government, who was going to be providing the insurance for these loans, sent employees of the federal government to literally every city and town in the country. It was a massive, massive project. And those surveyors went to every single neighborhood in every single city and rated each neighborhood on a 4-point scale, basically like A, B, C, D. Is this a neighborhood that is a strong, safe, solid neighborhood where the government won't be at risk if it backs a loan is an A, and then the poorest grade is government should not get into the business of backing loans because they're going to fail and they're going to end up costing the government a lot of money. And those lowest quality neighborhoods on every map that these federal government employees wrote, they outlined them in red, so redlining. And take a guess, what is the only criterion for a neighborhood to be red? One black family. No home loans at all. But any neighborhood that's all white, the federal government would click its fingers and immediately you have a home and you own your home and you can start building the enormous wealth that goes along with owning a home. So that was the early middle part of the 20th century. GI Bill was a huge problem. GI Bill built the middle class, in my opinion. All of the vets came home and they got a college education and a home loan. And that was a race neutral policy. Any vet was entitled to GI benefits, including black vets, but it couldn't get through Congress. The southern states wouldn't let the GI Bill get through Congress until everyone agreed that states would get to determine how and to whom the benefits were distributed. And even more than that, within most states, it was left to like cities and counties, like very local officials, to administer and say, yes, you're a vet who's qualified, no, you're not qualified. So of course, just black people didn't get their college educations or their home mortgages, even though they were entitled to them. Then the Highways Act was pretty huge. So cities started growing. We had the post-war wealth, the big booms. There was some wealth and there was a lot of poverty in the city. And we did a whole bunch of other things, including building like really shitty public housing that was horrible for black people in the middle of inner cities. But basically, all white families who had any money started taking their giant federal home mortgage subsidies out to the suburbs. And that was really only possible because the federal government spent just hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars, and this is in the 60s, so that's a lot of money, building the highways. And so it was only with the highways that it was feasible to live in, like, my girlfriend's parents live in Oak Park Terrace or something. It's like 35 minutes outside of Chicago, and they commuted into work every day. That's only possible if you can do that at 70 miles an hour. Otherwise, it's just like, it just doesn't make sense to build those suburbs. So the federal government just like directly subsidized the building of the suburbs through the home loans and the Federal Highways Act, which was just so much public money, except that black people didn't have any access to those mortgages, so they couldn't ever move to the suburbs. So they were de facto white suburbs. And then zoning laws are, absolutely terrible. So who's familiar with zoning laws? I mean, this is getting pretty wonky, but like basically every wealthy-ish, well-to-do neighborhood, city, suburb has a whole set of restrictive laws basically that are like, if you want to be a homeowner here, your lot has to be so big and your home has to be so big and kept up with this amount of quality. It can only be a single family home and blah, blah, blah. Basically, it's just a big gate and you can only get past the gate if you have enough money to get past the gate. Well, by the time we're 270 years of slavery and 75 years of Jim Crow and then blockbusting and race violence and segregation, well, black people just didn't have the wealth to do that. So these zoning laws are just a de facto way to help only wealthy people, which is to say white people, get into desirable neighborhoods. Mortgage interest deduction, this is the tax policy. So we're in the 70s. This is my least favorite public policy of all time. Like, if you want to see my head explode. Ooh. So we get to the 1970s and the federal government has been in the business of helping white people own homes for like 50 years now. And so what is the hardest part about buying a home? Like, what is the first difficult thing you have to do?
Down payment.
Yeah, you have to save a shit ton of money. It's like very, very hard to save that much money to get a home. Well, so when Congress in the 70s passed the mortgage interest deduction, they were like, well, we really want to encourage home ownership for everyone. We want to subsidize it. We want to make it easier to help people get into a home. So we're going to pass this policy where every year at tax time, if you had to pay interest on your mortgage, we're just going to give you a refund back through your refund check in the mail to help you own a home. Well, that's absurd. That doesn't in any way help you save the $20,000 or $30,000 that it takes to get a home in the first place, which is to say, just like the zoning laws, this is just another way to help people who are already wealthy enough, which is to say white people, just get a little bit more money in their pocket because they managed to get a home. And we spend like $85 billion a year on the mortgage interest deduction, and 75% of it goes to people in the top 20% of the income distribution. So that's and then predatory lending, 21st century style. This is like the housing bubble, the lead up to the Great Recession. Banks created these absurd mortgage products that like no one in their right mind could ever either hope to understand or actually manage financially. And the banks took them out to all of the low income, people of color, people who don't speak English communities, and peddled them as like these really great opportunities for the first time in your family's history you can get into a home. And of course those mortgages were just designed to explode down the line, and sure enough they did, and they left just millions and millions of low-income families underwater in their homes, which is terrible. So anyway, all that is to say, there is a tremendous amount of racism in public policy, and the end result of that is that for 120 years or so, the entire sort of premise of this country is that you need wealth to do well in this country, and the primary number one way to build wealth is through home ownership. I mean, that's the vast majority of all the wealth we have if you don't think about like the top 1%. Everybody below that, the vast majority of your wealth is in your home. And we've just been so profoundly in the business of building home wealth for white people and not in any way helping people who are not white build home wealth. And so the problem is like policies like segregation and race violence and blockbusting in the 19th century, that's inherited. Those policies that are 110 years old, they matter now. They matter to the way like young people are doing now. So like, for instance, my story, I'm white, I don't know if you noticed. My grandfather on my mother's side was also white, and he fought in the war, and he came back, and he got his college education, and he got his first home loan from the government. They bought a really nice home in St. Louis, suburban St. Louis. And so he had his government job and his education and his home, and sent all of his kids to good colleges. So that's nice for them. And then, so that's my mom, and she's educated, and she married someone who was educated. And they had human capital for that education. So then they got good jobs, and they could buy like a super duper nice home. And I grew up in this really nice home, and I went to a really good school. So that sets me up to get a really nice job out of college, and then my resume looks good. And so then I come to Duke, and I get like a nice little tuition subsidy to come to Duke, and like here I am, like yay for me. And that's like, I mean, it's just like so few steps between my grandfather got directly subsidized by the GI Bill in the late 40s, and here I am at 2017 at this like absurdly expensive, prestigious institution. Like, lucky me. And then like, what if my grandpa had been a 28-year-old black man in 1947 when he got back? He wouldn't have had any of those opportunities, and so his kids wouldn't have had those opportunities, and so their kids wouldn't have had their opportunities. And so like, if my grandfather had been a 28-year-old black man and I were sitting right here right now, boy, did I hustle to get here, right? Like, what did I do to get my ass here? Because like, I did not like have to hustle that hard to get here. I was already like that close. So again, my point is that policies from 1917 matter today. And so when you look at sort of the long arc of racism in public policy and the long arc of the history of violence in this country, it's all sort of intertwined. And so then, okay, what is sort of like a formal, rigorous way to put that together? Well, like I said at the beginning, I've been pretty disappointed with the state of violence research generally. As we talked about, housing wealth buys all the important stuff. It buys your neighborhood and your education and your safety and your clean air and your clean water, and the wealth of it subsidizes your college education, and it just goes on. And like, how many people who buy a home got some like wealth help from their parents? So like, the home value that we created in the 1930s is literally directly passed on generation to generation. So keep that in mind. So then what the state of violence literature is that there are really rigorous, robust correlations between violence and poverty, unemployment, education, segregation, all of these things. So that's like well established in the literature. And people sort of just casually talk about those as like the causes of violence. Well, okay, but like, I don't consider either of those a fundamental cause of violence, because something creates poverty and something creates unemployment and something creates disparities in education, etc. The other correlation that's just like the most robust and accepted correlation, of course, is between black population and violence. If you got more black people in a place, you got more violence in a place. So obviously for 100 years, people who suck have really used that narrative to help craft policy. But again, I don't consider that a fundamental cause. Like, you would have to be crazy to think that like a certain group of people is just more prone to violence. I don't think that's true. So we built racism, segregation, and inequality in this country through public policy, as I just take through that list of things. Like, we have built all of those sort of intermediary conditions that are highly correlated with violence. And so I hypothesize that we also built the level of violence that we have in this country because we specifically have designed every institution in this country to systematically put black people into the worst situations, the situations with the most segregation and the most poverty and the most unemployment and the least access to jobs and other opportunity. So I think that the fundamental cause of all of those things and therefore violence is the racism that we have built into our public policy that is designed specifically to help white people and hurt non-white people. So that's my hypothesis. To test this empirically, which I plan to do, but I don't have my data fully together yet, is I need to find a way to measure racism in public policy. And so what I've decided to do is just look at cities all over the country and measure the disparities in housing wealth by race. So like, I think it stands to reason, based on that list of all of the racist housing policies, it stands to reason that white people will have much more housing wealth than black people will, because it's just so much harder for a black person to get a home in this country and therefore to build wealth. And so if I can measure disparities in wealth and I can measure levels of violence, then I can start to test the correlation between the two. So then this is just for the like 3 nerdy people in the room. So I have a panel data set. It's 270 cities and 11 years for each city. And so I can do a nice little panel regression with fixed effects. And I think that that's particularly interesting right now because my data span from 2005 to 2015. So that's during the last run up of the housing bubble and then the crash. So we're going to have a lot of variation in housing wealth. And I assume that as the crash happens, the crash is going to be harder for people of color, which is to say that disparity in housing wealth is going to grow. And at the same time, that violence that had been falling so steadily, it started to bounce around a little bit, especially in some cities. So we're going to have some really nice variation there. And then I know that you're like, oh, well, but what's your, yeah, and I know you're like, yeah, but what's your identification strategy? Guess what? I don't have one. So I'm a real fan of saying that there is no proof in social science. You can't ever, if someone tells you that they prove something in social science, they're either lying to you or they're stupid. But what we can do instead is we can start to accumulate evidence. And as you build more and more evidence, eventually, if you're a credible person, you have to start to accept something is true. And my read of the literature is that there is very little or no evidence yet accumulated about the direct relationship between racism and public policy and negative externalities in the form of violence. So I don't have a good identification strategy. I can't argue for any sort of randomization or whatever, but I think I can present some pretty compelling evidence, and I've started to look at some correlations and they look like you'd expect. Cool.
All right.
All right, so I'm going to talk about monkeys. Hey, everyone likes monkeys. So specifically, so I'm Nathan Walker. I'm going to be talking about a habitat connectivity analysis I did for the San Martin titi monkey in northern central Peru. And this is kind of a practice talk for one that I'm going to be giving in a few weeks for the Data and Visualization Services Friday Forum, which is a weekly interdisciplinary meeting where they bring in people to talk about data and visualizations and all kinds of cool stuff. If you haven't been to those, they're always good. They have people from art history and electronics and all kinds of just random topics. So it's usually fun.
12 o'clock on Fridays.
12 to 1, the LSRC, like D106 or something like that. It's the LSRC building and then like the far left-hand side. Anyway, but it's, if you haven't been there, they always have interesting things. Oh, I have to switch this, right? Okay, so first of all, I'm just going to be talking a little bit of background about my project and about the general approach that I've taken, and then I'll move on from there. move on from there to talking more about some specifics about the methods that I'm using. So this summer I went to Peru. I took this picture. This place is awesome.
Peru.
That's basically all I want to say. I was specifically working not in Machu Picchu, but in Moyobamba, which is in northern central Peru. And this area is where you can find the San Martin titi monkey, which is an endemic monkey species that's only found right around this region. This is a highly endangered monkey species. It's one of the top 25 most threatened primates in the world. So there are a lot of important conservation issues going on around this species. And so my specific project was on habitat connectivity analysis. So basically what this is trying to do is trying to say, okay, we know that this area here is important for this species, and we know that over here there's some other area that's important habitat for this species. We want to make sure that it's possible for the monkey to travel between these two areas, which means that we need to identify which places are most important to maintain the connectivity for in order to get the monkey from point A to point B. So to do that, this what you see here, landscapes are big and complicated. So I'll just simplify this using variety of methods, but the one I'm using is called graph theory, which basically takes that big complicated landscape and just reduces it down to points and lines, which are much easier to analyze. So what we do is we identify the points. The points here represent habitat patches, and then the lines represent connections between patches. And so what that gives us is we just have to build this network, and then we can analyze it in order to identify which of these points are most important to conserve in order to maintain connectivity between different areas of the network. So in order to do that, basically all we have to do is just find where the habitat patch is, and then we have to identify how far away they are from each other using some kind of measure. So one way of doing that would be to just take Euclidean distance, which is basically you just draw a line between these two habitat patches, you take out a ruler, you measure how long the line is, and you call it done. So that's the simplest approach. There are some issues with it, notably, so it doesn't take landscape into account. So it basically assumes you have a lake there, you have a mountain, whatever, the monkey is just going to swim straight across the lake, it's going to climb straight over the mountain, no big deal. So that's not the best approach to use. So what most people do instead is called a least cost distance analysis. So what that does is you take the landscape and you reduce it to a bunch of pixels, and then for each pixel you assign it to some kind of cost value. So you say, monkeys don't like climbing mountains or swimming across lakes. Those have high cost values. They like traveling through forests, so those have low cost values, and you assign some value based on the ease of travel and mortality and other things. And then you can just find basically what's the shortest line or the least cost line possible to travel through that landscape. So this is a major improvement, but it also has some issues. So it doesn't take into account shape or the number of routes that are possible between patches, which means that from the perspective of this analysis, this landscape and this landscape are identical. Whereas in reality, if you have a landscape that looks like this, there may be just like a very small number of routes that are possible to get from point A to point B, given the dispersal distance for the species. So it may not have, you have to just take exactly the right direction and travel exactly the right path to get there. Whereas in this landscape, you may have lots of different possibilities. So basically you just kind of head off somewhere in that general direction, and you've got a pretty good chance of running into another patch of habitat. So a traditional least cost path analysis doesn't take that into account. So what I've been trying to do is to come up with some analysis that better accounts for that. And the way that I've hit upon is to go from graph analysis to multigraphs, which is an analysis approach that's been used in other fields but hasn't been used very much in ecology. And basically what we're doing is we're taking that same type of analysis, we're creating multiple lines between each patch representing the different routes that are possible. So this helps for a few things. One, it reduces uncertainty. With a traditional least cost path analysis, you're just kind of, you have this line that represents a distance, but you don't really have any way of gauging how likely it is a monkey would actually take that route. This, we still don't know what the probability is that a monkey is going to take any particular route, but we can kind of say, okay, between these two patches, there's lots of routes that are possible. Between these two patches, there aren't very many possible. Therefore, it's probably more likely that we're going to have more dispersal between these two patches here. This is also useful for thinking about resilience. So you're trying to make some kind of conservation plans given climate change and land degradation and other things. And with this approach, you can look at this and say, okay, if we have some habitat degradation here and that route is lost, there's still going to be lots of paths possible between those two habitat patches. On the other hand, over here, if you have some habitat loss here, that could make a monkey have to travel a long way around. So basically, if you're trying to come up with some kind of conservation plan, you might want to prioritize places where there's more likely to be greater redundancy and greater stability of connections in the future. So in terms of how I actually do this, we'll go into methods now. This is fairly similar at the beginning to least cost path analysis. We start off by identifying the so we start off by identifying habitat patches here in green, and then we create some kind of cost surface. And here I'm just, for simplicity, I'm just saying that all this has the same value. And then we calculate a cost distance. So if we're starting from this patch here and moving outward, as we move further out, we're accumulating a greater cost. And then what we do is we identify which of these pixels has the least cost. So in this case, if you want to get from this patch to this patch, this is the nearest option. And then we could draw a line there, but the important thing is that we're using that in order to build in a value for that graph that we're building. So that's the least cost path analysis. This is the approach that I'm doing with using multiple low cost paths. This starts off somewhat similar. We build the cost surface and the habitat patches. Again, we build a cost distance. This time we threshold this given a known dispersal value distance for the species. We can say the monkey is going to travel out to there. And then what we do is we identify which places in this patch can you reach given that dispersal distance. And then again, we could use this to draw routes if we wanted to, but the important thing is that we can use that to build this multi-graph. So we have the least cost path, but then we also have these various low cost paths as well. So this helps us capture more information about the landscape. So I'm just going to walk you through kind of an example of this. Here we have a patch with a black line around it. This represents a source patch. And then we identify the cost to reach each individual cell on all these other patches. And then we identify which ones can we reach given the dispersal distance for the species. And we can see just from looking at this is that, so there's some of these patches here that have lots and lots of cells that you can reach if you head off from some kind of direction from this patch here. On the other hand, down here, there's really only a few cells that are reachable, which means that monkey has to leave from just the right point and travel just the right route in order to get those. So just from looking at this, you can kind of gauge that, okay, there's some of these patches that it's going to be easier for a monkey to reach than others, and this is all information that we would not have if we just did your traditional least cost path analysis. So that we do that for this one patch, then we repeat that for each separate patch, and then we build that all together into a graph. So just for comparison, this is the graph that we would have using a least cost path analysis for that landscape that we just saw with 341 lines between the points. And this is what we get with the multi-graph analysis with over 11,000. So this is capturing a lot more information about the underlying landscape. And I don't know how well you can see in the back, but so there's some of these that only have a few lines between them, others that have lots and lots of lines. So this is capturing a lot more information. So this, as I said, was just one small sub-area of the landscape. The next thing is to move on to the full landscape. So again, each one of these points here represents a habitat patch, and each one of the lines represents a connection between patches. And what you can see from this is that the full landscape is quite a bit larger and more complex. So it's going to be a bit more challenging to analyze this. So that's the part that I'm still working on, is how to actually analyze this network here. So what I'm currently exploring is for several different metrics that you can use to evaluate the landscape. What I'm doing is so here's just, I'll walk you through one of them. This is called the betweenness value, which is basically the value for any one patch in connecting more distant parts of the landscape. And I'm scaling the size of these patches based on that betweenness value. So the larger circles represent places that are more important as stepping stones. And then what I do is I'm going to sequentially remove one line at a time between each pair of patches in order to see, okay, we remove one line, how does that value change? We remove another line, how does that change? And then, so what we'll see is that as we remove some of them, there's going to be some places are going to become less important as they suddenly become isolated. Other patches are going to become more important as they go from being more peripheral to the network to being more central, having more traffic go through them as more central connections get lost. So we're sequentially removing lines, and what you can kind of see is as we remove these lines, places become more important, less important, and I'm kind of speeding this up now because it would take too long otherwise. But you can kind of see that these places are bouncing around. As we remove more and more habitat, more and more connections, this becomes more and more abstract and meaningless. So we just eventually get just like habitat patch left. We've removed everything else in the landscape except the last one. So the important part of that is that we have each one of those different time steps, which means that we can say which places would be most important for this value now, which ones would be most important if we remove 5% of these connections, 10% down to eventually if we just wipe out everything. And then we can prioritize places that are both important now and that would continue to be important in the event of this kind of habitat degradation. So one thing I kind of glossed over was setting those land costs. This is kind of cutting off the bottom of this. Oh, I guess it's there. But so each of these is the different type of land cover, and so we need to set a cost value for each one of these land classes. What a lot of people do is just set one value for each one of these. What I decided to do instead is I talked to a group of experts and got low and high ranges for each one of these values, and then I'm using those values in order to create a low-cost surface based on those values and a high-cost surface. So what that gives us is you have the low-cost surface, so low cost, so high connectivity, and higher costs, so lower connectivity. And then we'll be able to, and then various things in between. And that will allow us to gauge which places would be more important based on different assumptions about what the landscape actually looks like. And the other thing I tested was doing some spatial variation, so basically just kind of moving some values around, making some areas higher, making some areas lower, in order to see how that changes the results. And what we can see from that is that, so for some of these places will become, have more or less, more zero connections as we change the underlying assumption about what the landscape looks like. So basically that big complicated landscape that I showed earlier, which then had hundreds of different time steps, I'm repeating that for several different types of connectivity metrics. And then I'm repeating that for 15 different assumptions about what the underlying landscape looks like. And then the next step is to take all that together in order to prioritize which areas are most important to conserve in order to help the species. So thanks to everyone who supported this and gave me funding. And I guess we can move on to questions for all of us.
Have there been any studies that you could comment on with regards to violence in more homogeneous countries, such as like Scandinavian ones or Japan, in order to kind of corroborate your suggestion that the race disparities are contributing to violence?
That's a great question.
Well, what about just more homogeneous states, where state policy is going to, by nature, be less? I mean, I'm from Iowa. It's like 94% white, right? So, like, any policy we have is it's going to be on the margin of.
Yeah, the problem that you get into really quick there, you said Idaho? Iowa. The problem you get into there is maybe not Iowa, but some of the most homogenous states are also the least populous, and you just get into vanishingly low crime rates.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so I have a question. So you said you weren't, that concerned about identification right now.
Like, I would love to be able to do it.
Okay, well, I'm an economist, and we're like obsessed with identification, right? And so I don't know are you familiar with this paper by Leah Platt-Buston? And the paper's titled was Post-War Suburbanization, White Flight, Evidence from Black Migration. And so basically what she does is she actually instruments for Black population in cities using local economic conditions in those cities at the time of the Great Migration. And so basically that's how she gets exogeneity and how much in Black migration. And so I was wondering if you had thought about using that as a source of variation.
She can plausibly argue that the economic conditions are exogenous?
You convince the economists. I'm not super familiar with
Because
it.
my philosophy on instruments is show me your instrument, I'll tell you why it's not a good one. But
Sure.
I would love. Could you email me that?
Yes. Could I get your...
Follow up with that, I agree with you on instruments. It's going to be really iffy. But you could consider a latent variable analysis. And at the very least, consider random effects.
So we should talk. Let's talk.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, and you can try to convince me that I should use random effects.
I think, Nicole, you need to have a special workshop
I was wondering, did you see the, there was a talk that was given last year that I think got some press around it, but it was about looking at the effects of redlining on trees in Durham.
Yeah. Super interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was showing basically that currently the decision on where to plant trees is based on where they plant trees where there was a previous tree, where the tree fell down, wherever they go in, they plant another one. But the where the trees are is based on redlining practices. So current tree planting is based on their
Where white people lived 100 years ago. Yeah.
I have a question for George. So your talk explained a lot about the processor side of like where how we've sort of reached the ceiling. I've also heard a lot of people talking about batteries and power and stuff like that. So I'm wondering how that squares with what you do.
Well, batteries haven't. If you think about how much the processor has progressed over the past 50 years, I think I've heard of like it's a statistic that if the automotive industry would progress at the same rate, cars would be going faster than the speed of light. But batteries definitely haven't. I mean, batteries are all chemistry, and we've hit a limit on batteries, pretty much. Or we've never been able to progress as fast with batteries as we've been able to progress with processors. There's really no Moore's law equivalent with batteries. Like the fundamental cell of a battery is the battery itself, whereas the processor is a bunch of different. Or like you have a fundamental cell that we've been able to shrink by orders of magnitude and caused orders of magnitude improvement, whereas the battery we just haven't been able to improve on fundamental, what fundamentally a battery is. So that hasn't improved, therefore battery technology hasn't improved to the same extent that processor technology has.
Well, phones are what, like 90% battery or something like that?
So
Phones are what, like 90% battery or something like that?
by weight or maybe by weight, 90% battery. But that's basically right now, I mean, in terms of like what sells, batteries, like if you can create a phone that charged instantly, that would sell quicker than any other phone on the market. Like you could control the market if you created a battery that was more, had more exceptional performance than any other phone. So the batteries right now, they're a very big part of what a phone is.
Was the problem with the Samsung Galaxy the processor or the battery?
Battery exploded in 2007. I actually don't know too much about that battery specifically, but it didn't work out too well. It was a problem with the battery.
Just been hearing about it on every airplane for a few months.
I had a question for you. So did part of your project involve also like designating what patches were? And like, I guess, what do those look like? How do you determine where a patch ends?
Right. It's basically, so I have a land classification for this area, and I'm basically saying everything that's forest has more than 10 hectares of contiguous forest is a patch.
And do you have like a specification on what the monkeys need to like travel between patches?
Yeah, so basically I'm using the estimated daily travel distance, and then basically adjusting that for the cross surface, multiple travel. But so it's based on an estimate of how far a monkey will travel in a day.
How far will a monkey travel?
660 meters.
Is that on average, or is that?
Well, that's based on what some people estimated from their field research. I mean, they could probably run flat further than that if you force them to. But
I mean, that's like half a mile.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like typical. I mean, that's typical travel distance. It's not necessarily what they would be capable of under.
Direct.
If you were chasing after them, again, they could probably.
And what are the threats that they're?
Sorry, I should have said that. So that's mostly logging, deforestation, and then land conversion to agriculture. And then there's some issues with pet trading and that kind of thing as well, and poaching.
So I'm curious, this is really cool stuff, and there are so many species that are at this like level of threatened and endangered,
Yeah.
and if we need an interested master's student to like save each of them, it's going to take a long time. So what, like, your method, do you think there's any scope for being able to look at things like satellite photos and do the land classifications that way and sort of more
Yeah.
automate this?
Yeah, well, so that's what this is. So the land classification is based on satellite.
Okay.
So this is following up from some work that Donica Schaefer-Smith did, a PhD student. So she did the land classification based on satellite remote sensing, and then I'm taking those data and using them to analyze. But yeah, so she wrote a paper where she went through all the different stages of this. So she did the remote sensing work, and then she built a species distribution model, and then she did a connectivity analysis, and then she did a prioritization, and just kind of, it was a rapid assessment of those various things.
So for any animal you want to look at, you'd need one of these maps, and then sort of just information about how far it will travel, or like habitats it won't travel across.
Yeah, and that's one of the advantages of this analysis method. It doesn't really take a whole lot of information. There's other kinds of things that you can build very specific individual-based models if you know more specific information about how they move and how they interact with different types of habitat. Here you're basically just saying, we think they travel roughly this distance, we think they kind of like forests and they kind of don't like other things, and so you can build that using a lot less information.
Cool.
Question. So, I'm not, I'm trying to wrap my head around the way you talk about how you would print this, information as a 1D or in a 1D or 2D format. And I just don't understand how that can function in a laptop or a phone.
Right. So a nanomaterial is a material that is inherently 1D or 2D. So it's just a material. That's what I was talking about, 1D or 2D. When I said 1D or 2D, nanomaterials are just materials whose lattice, have you heard of like crystal structure? Yeah. The crystal structure of a nanomaterial lies in the plane. Or the crystal structure of a 1D nanomaterial is just a straight line. And these nanomaterials just have unique electrical and mechanical properties. And we still, in printed electronics, we still just, basically what we do is like, if you look at what a nanomaterial, and you look at it with your eye, like say you put a bunch of nanomaterials in water, and you look at the water with your eye, you just see a bunch of like junk, like salt in water. You just see a bunch of particles. But what we can do is, you have to look at it under a microscope to see like it's 1D or 2D. But what we can do is we can put it in some solution and aerosolize the solution into a mist, and then spray that mist on some surface. And then the nanomaterial, which the mist is full of nanomaterials, those nanomaterials evaporate on the surface and can make some like conductive wire that lies on the surface.
But at that point, it will be 3D.
At that point, it's like a conglomerate of nanomaterials on a surface. But the nanomaterials individually are 1D and 2D materials.
Okay.
If that makes sense. Sorry, that was a little bit drawn out.
No. I'm just like trying to see how it all like fits together when you're building the actual product.
Right. Once we get it aerosolized, we print the circuit just like a regular printer in your home would print ink. You just print the circuit and connect wires to different points on the circuit.
Right.
That's basically how it works.
Just out of curiosity, what is the thickness?
The thickness of the ink that we use, like so when you print it, basically they're conglomerates of particles, it's a bunch of nanomaterials. Thickness right now is typically like 30 microns, which you can see the lines, but you couldn't see it if you looked at the thickness of it, but the lines are pretty thin.
How does the connectivity compare like normal CPC with wire?
Not good, so that's why this is still a research topic. We're trying to get it to the point where we can just use like, instead of wires, we can use printed wires, but it's evolving quickly.
Does anyone else have a question for me? Okay, so I have another question then for Zach.
Great.
So then what? Right? So you say, okay, this is the evidence that I've collected that, public policies have, been inherently racist and have led to these, situations, housing violence.
Yeah. So
What do we do about it, right?
so realist.
I'm
Yeah.
thinking just, well, it has a quick sort of anecdote. I know
Sure.
a guy who is a part of Preservation Bureau, right? And I live close to downtown, and the gentrification there has been insane in the past 5 years especially. And home prices are like going up like crazy. They're kicking people out so they can basically just tear down, you know, these like low income apartments and stuff like that and put up these luxury condos. And, you know, Durham doesn't have any kind of affordable housing policy. So, you know, my question is like, okay, this is what you're doing, this is what you're finding, how do we incentivize, you know, better housing
Yeah.
policy?
So great question. So like, let's assume that I find some plausible identification strategy and I can prove that like housing disparities cause violence. Realistically, we're not going to do anything about it. I mean, people don't care about having just housing policy in this country. Like we just don't. But optimistically, what I think would be super cool is to maybe build a social impact bond where you can say, well, here's the economic case for changing the way we construct housing and the way we subsidize housing. And if we do it this way and we track it well, then we can bring back X number of dollars over time. And then we can use those dollars that we can bring back as an incentive, as like a financial economic incentive to change the way we build housing policy. So that's why I'm pretty interested. That's why I am going into local government and I'm not going to be doing this research thing anymore, because there are people who are way smarter than I am who can find a good identification strategy. I want to be able to use it to get really creative and clever about how I wrangle incentives to change the way, but like, are we actually ever gonna like?
Right. My question to this guy at Preservation Bureau is, well, you know, I mean, why can't we build in affordable housing as like a percentage of some of these giant, you know, condo?
Because that's money out of his pocket.
Yeah, exactly. And that was his response, is like no incentive for the developer.
There is a neighborhood in South Durham that's doing more or less that. My friends built a house there, and it's like south of the ballpark, and it's all new houses, and it's like 1 for 1. So like one non-low income family purchases one house, and then they have some system. I don't know exactly how it works, but then like one goes up for a low income family.
I talked to a local activist who has been in that area for a while. He's an older black guy. He and his family and many people have been in that area, and it's a good thing to do. And generally they're happy about it, but it's also like very much disrupting the community, and a lot of people are still finding themselves getting pushed out. But it's better than nothing.
So it seems like lead pipes are also connected to housing and violence. Is that something? Is that just beyond the scope of what you can consider?
Yeah, not for this paper. I actually find the empirical, speaking of like plausible identification strategies, I find the empirical literature on the lead and violence connection weaker than a lot of people make it out to be. And as one of my favorite economists, whose name is I'm blanking on right now, says, if you were to add up all of the effect sizes of everything that's been proven to cause violence, you would reduce violence by 140%, which of course is not possible. But yeah, maybe.